They will transform every aspect of global economic interaction. They will become the dominant player in world trade. They will become an enormous source of not just markets for investors, but also a source of funds invested in different parts of the world. They are already, of course, the major source of migrants, but because of demographics, because they have relatively young populations, they will provide many more migrants. And they will also become, this is the negative side, the biggest source of carbon emissions in the world. In short, in a little around a generation from now, 6 of the 7 largest economies of the world will be developing economies.
Essentially, there'll be a few blocks, I would say. There'll be the United States, there will be Europe. All the European countries will be relatively small compared to the giants, which are the US, China, and India. But together, as the European Union, they will still rank as one of the largest groups in the world. And then there'll be the 2 major, China and India, which will be 2 of the 3 largest countries in the world. And we suspect that trade, that financial interactions, that all the exchanges that go on in the international marketplace will be guided and determined in a lot of ways by how those blocks work together and how they interact.
International trade is perhaps the single most important driver of the modernization of the global economy today. Because through trade, not only do countries become more efficient because they specialize, but developing countries learn primarily by engaging in international trade about the modern technologies, the modern products, and indeed by importing many of those products directly, including sophisticated machinery, etc. They import technology. Through trade, you also attract foreign direct investment because foreign investors like to base themselves in lower cost locales, like to export from there, and like to exploit the markets of developing countries. Foreign direct investment also brings a lot of technology and learning. So for all of these reasons, international trade and its increase lie at the very heart of this process, which promises large increases in living standards. As I said before, developing countries will become the central players in international trade. So, for example, the United States will very probably, within a generation or so, be trading much more with China and with Latin America than it does with Western Europe. Traditionally, its most important trading partner. And Western Europe will equally be trading more with China and India than it will be with the United States.
The benefits will be there'll be tremendous opportunities for investments, for diversification, for gaining the kind of increases in income that you can achieve when you have open capital markets and you have liberalized financial systems. Unfortunately, the risks and the potential costs of that are perhaps even greater. And it's important to remember that these countries like China and India and Brazil, they'll be big, but since they'll also be poor, they'll be weak in some ways. Their institutions won't be as strong as many are in the advanced countries. They have been more prone to crisis, and when financial crises occur, they tend to be more penalized because they lack the kinds of fiscal policy space, automatic stabilizers, and the regulatory institutions that can cope with dramatic crises. So you have very large countries that are more subject to more disastrous financial crises. You have a recipe for increasing global volatility over the next few decades.
There are two ways of addressing climate change. The most expensive way is to adapt to it. Okay? Problem is that while some industrial countries, particularly those in the more northern climes, will have a relatively easy adjustment. You know, if you're in a northern climb and have a relatively high elevation, you're not going to be terribly worried about a little bit of global warming, 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, which doesn't sound like much, but is a huge change. But you won't worry about it so much, and you won't have to worry about coastal flooding. But if you are a poor country, like Bangladesh, for example, which is low-lying and in a very hot climate, that'll be disastrous, especially since a country like Bangladesh has very little by way of resources and capacity to adapt. So adaptation is open for some countries, particularly the wealthier ones. But the best way to deal with climate change is to reduce carbon emissions. And that means changing the way that we use energy, finding more efficient, carbon-efficient forms of energy, greener technologies. But there are various other things, many other things you can do to basically produce the same kinds of goods we produce today, but much more efficiently from a carbon point of view. And that is the mitigation, and that requires some government action, either imposing a carbon tax or some form of capping emissions and giving people the right to trade them. One way or another, reducing emissions and mitigating climate change will require international coordination.
Migration is a mess. At least international migration is a mess. What's going to happen is many of the developing countries have relatively young populations. And even though a lot of them will be growing rapidly, the income differential with advanced countries will remain very large. So, and in addition, as their incomes increase, even from low levels, they'll have greater ability to migrate. So you'll have increasing pressures for international migration from the poor countries. At the same time, the aging of the populations in industrial countries are going to increase the demand for migrants. So there's a lot of good reasons why international migration should increase and why it should generate greater benefits over the next 2, 3, 4 decades. On the other hand, the migration regimes in most of the advanced countries are fairly broken. And they really have not achieved any reconciliation of the conflicts between trying to capture the economic benefits of migration while avoiding what many people perceive as social costs, particularly low-skilled migration. The result has been a lot of illegal migration, a loss of control, in a sense, of migration policy, because they can neither keep everybody out nor let everybody in. And the tension between that increasing pressure for migration, on the one hand, and the inability of advanced countries' policy regimes really to manage it is potentially very adverse consequences for the advanced countries. because they have to choose between even more draconian assaults on civil liberties in order to control migrants, or letting everyone in a sense, perhaps losing some sense of social cohesion. So that tension is going to exacerbate over the coming years. Policy choices in this area are more driven by social values than by economics. The economics are clear. Migration is extraordinarily helpful to advanced countries, and the United States is a much more dynamic economy because it has a lot of international migrants. I think at least you could say that they ought to choose means of control that address the economics of migration and not treat migration as a crime or a moral issue. So, for example, enforcing restrictions on migration by making sure that employers verify citizenship and fining the employers who don't do that is a much more efficient and reasonable way of enforcing migration restrictions than stopping people on the street and asking if they're migrants, or sending police officers or immigration officials to workplaces and having them chase everybody away, or trying to corral people as they cross the border. Migration is an economic issue. It has benefits, it has costs, it has distributional consequences. It should be treated as an economic policy question. Africa is certainly a large source of resources, and to some extent immigrants, but to a large degree, Sub-Saharan Africa has been marginalized because of extreme levels of poverty. Almost half of Sub-Saharan Africans' population live at what we call absolute poverty, less than $1.25 a day, and also because of weak institutions and poor governance structures and a history of conflict and a whole host of reasons that have made it very difficult for Africa to effectively have a voice and an impact on the global economy. I think that's going to change. I think that the rise of the major developing, China, India, Brazil, that's going to create opportunities for African economies to export low-wage manufacturers as the other economies become, their wage levels rise, to get a lot of investment from these countries as their ability to do so increases, and you already see a lot of that. But in order for Africa to capture those benefits, they have to put in place the kinds of institutions that some of the other emerging markets have been able to do.
Obviously, with China rising so rapidly in economic importance, there are going to have to be more compromises. There already are today about what the United States can and cannot do. Furthermore, the cost of various types of interventions will rise relative to the power of the United States to afford those costs, simply because the world economy is going to be so much bigger. Whatever issue you're confronting will be, in some sense, more expensive. But there's nothing inevitable or, let's call it, mathematical about this. Countries have influence in ways that go beyond money or economic capacity. Values that can be projected are tremendously important, and whether people like those values and want to be associated with them is tremendously important. So for these reasons, and given the large differences in democracy and governance between the United States today and China, for example, I think that the United States can continue to have a lot of influence for the foreseeable future. But it also faces a major adjustment as it confronts this new reality where it isn't, by far the largest economy in the world. In order for the large countries to strike deals, they will be the decision makers. The decisions are going to be struck they're going to be made in Washington and Beijing. They're not going to be made at the WTO in Geneva or the United Nations in New York. In order for them to strike these deals, they have to bring their people along. The populations and the politicians and the local politicians in these countries are going to have to understand why they need to make these compromises so that you can live together in this more integrating and faster growing world. And that is what a global conscience is about. It's about having a greater awareness of the global implications of our actions. And of course it's easier said than done to create a global conscience. But I believe, we believe, that a combination of education, research, analysis, the workings of civil society, and international dialogue itself, over time, increases the potential of creating a social conscience in the same way that nation states were created in the 19th century, before or after. And there are indeed national consciences today. And we need to widen